Sunday dinner at my mother-in-law's house hadn't even made it to coffee when my husband lifted his bourbon, pointed at me with 2 fingers and said, "Without me, she'd have nothing." Everybody laughed. Not a polite little chuckle either. A real laugh. My sister-in-law Denise leaned back in her chair. Her husband Rick nearly snorted iced tea through his nose. Then Marilyn, my mother-in-law, smiled at me over the rim of her wineglass and added, "And be nobody." That got another round. I looked at my husband. Mark was still grinning, so I said, "Want to tell her?" His smile disappeared so fast it was almost impressive. Marilyn caught it. She lowered her glass. "Tell me what." Mark looked at me, then at his mother. "Nothing." I said nothing. He added, "Laura's being dramatic." I nodded. Okay. That one word bothered him more than if I'd thrown my napkin at his head. You could see it. For the rest of dinner, Mark kept checking my face whenever he thought I wasn't looking. Marilyn tried to move things along by asking Denise about her new kitchen countertops. Rick started talking about property taxes. Somebody mentioned the Bengals. Normal family conversation came crawling back onto the table like it had been hiding underneath it. I ate half a piece of cheesecake. Mark barely touched his. We'd been married 26 years. Long enough that I knew when he was angry, embarrassed, scared, or pretending not to be any of those things. That night he was all for. The minute we got into the SUV, he shut the driver's door harder than necessary. What exactly was that supposed to mean? I buckled my seatbelt. What? He stared at me. "Want to tell her?" "Oh, that. Yes, Laura, that." I looked out through the windshield at Marilyn's front porch. She still had one of those ceramic geese by the door. She changed its little outfits with the seasons. Right then it was wearing a red Ohio State sweater. I said I could ask you the same thing. "About what?" "The joke." He blew out a breath. "Oh, come on. No, seriously. Which part was funny? The part where you said I'd have nothing without you, or the part where your mother said I'd be nobody?" It was dinner table teasing, was it? Yes. Everybody seemed to enjoy it. He started the car. "You're making this into something it wasn't." Then he pulled away from the curb and made the mistake that changed the whole conversation. "Besides," he said, "everybody knows I've carried us financially." I turned and looked at him. "Everybody?" "You know what I mean." I did. That was the problem. When Mark and I got married, we didn't have much worth fighting over. He was 29. I was 26. We rented a duplex in Worthington where the upstairs neighbor vacuumed at 6 in the morning every Saturday like she had a personal grudge against carpet. I worked in commercial insurance. Mark worked for a regional janitorial company and hated nearly every minute of it. Then one night he came home, dropped his keys on the kitchen table and said, "I can do this better than they can." I said, "Do what? Run the whole thing." That was how Bennett Commercial Services started. Not in an office. Not with investors. At our dining room's table, Mark handled sales and crews. I handled everything he hated. Invoices, insurance, payroll, client calls, vendor paperwork, late payments. There were nights when I sat there with a calculator, a legal pad, and cold coffee while Mark was out measuring office buildings for bids. For the first few years when he said, "We built this," he meant it. When Emily was born, I cut my hours at the insurance agency. Later, I left completely. It made sense then. Childcare was expensive, the company was growing, and somebody had to keep the books from turning into a crime scene. I never thought of myself as sacrificing a career in some dramatic way. We were building one life together. At least that was how I understood it. Once the business grew enough to hire an office manager, I slowly stepped back. Then, somewhere along the way, the language changed. When I started the company, then it became my company. Marilyn loved that version. At Christmas, she'd tell relatives Mark built that business from scratch. At cookouts, she'd say, "My son never depended on anybody. I usually let it go." Correcting your mother-in-law over potato salad is rarely worth the energy. But years earlier, Mark had said something I hadn't forgotten. We were going through tax papers in his home office when he tapped a folder and said, "We ought to clean up the ownership paperwork someday." I looked up. "Clean it up how? Well, you're not really involved anymore." So, he shrugged. Put things where they actually belong. I laughed because I thought he was being practical in that irritating way he sometimes was. "Where do they belong?" He said, "Forget it." And I did, mostly. Then 6 months before that Sunday dinner, Mark needed my signature on documents related to refinancing some company equipment. I sat at the kitchen island and actually read them. Buried in the packet was a copy of the old operating agreement. Bennett Commercial Services. Mark Bennett 50%. Laura Bennett 50%. Exactly the way it had been from the beginning. I remember looking at the page and thinking, well, of course. It wasn't a secret. It wasn't some buried inheritance or surprise asset. Mark knew, I knew, our accountant knew, but over the years Mark had started acting as if my half was a technicality, something left over from the old days, something that counted on tax forms but not at family dinners. I hadn't confronted him about it. Not really. So when I asked Want to tell her at Marilyn's table, I wasn't revealing anything. I was asking Mark whether he wanted to tell his mother the version of our life he never included in his speeches. But the look on his face told me something I hadn't expected. He thought I knew more than that. That night after we got home, Mark brushed his teeth, climbed into bed, and stared at his phone for a while. Then he said, "Don't embarrass me like that in front of my family again." I turned my head on the pillow. "I embarrassed you." He locked his phone. "You knew what you were doing." "No, I knew what you were doing." He reached over and switched off the lamp. Conversation over. Apparently. I lay there listening to the furnace kick on. For years I'd wondered whether Mark really appreciated what I had given up, what I'd helped build, and how much of myself had disappeared into the word wife. But that night I started asking a different question. Not whether he appreciated me, whether he had been counting on me never looking too closely. The strange thing was, Monday morning looked exactly like every other Monday morning. Mark made coffee. I unloaded the dishwasher. He stood at the kitchen counter scrolling through emails while I tried to find the lid to a plastic container that had apparently entered witness protection. "You going to Kroger today?" he asked. "Probably. We're out of coffee filters." "I know. And those little oranges. Clementines. Whatever they're calling them this week. 26 years of marriage, and apparently that was what came after your husband announced to a room full of people that you'd be nobody without him. Clementines." Mark kissed my cheek before he left. "See you tonight." Okay. I stood there after the garage door closed, holding that stupid plastic lid. Part of me wanted him to come back. Not because I wanted another fight. I wanted him to walk through the door and say, "That was ugly." "I'm sorry." He didn't. By Wednesday I was starting to wonder whether I was the one making too much of it. That's embarrassing to admit, but it's true. When you've been married that long, you don't judge the whole thing by one bad Sunday dinner. Mark had sat beside me when my father died. He'd driven through an ice storm to get Emily from college after her car broke down. When I had my gallbladder removed, he slept in that miserable hospital chair and complained only once, which for Mark was practically sainthood. We had history, real history, good and bad. You don't throw 26 years in a dumpster because your husband acted like an ass over cheesecake. At least that was what I kept telling myself. Then Emily called. She was 24 by then, living in Cincinnati and working as a physical therapist. She usually called during her drive home, which meant I got 40 minutes of traffic patients she couldn't name, and complaints about the price of groceries. That afternoon, somewhere between her telling me avocados were $2 apiece and asking whether I still had her high school yearbooks, I said, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Do you think your father respects me?" Silence. I could hear her turn signal clicking. Finally she said, "Wow." That was not where I thought this conversation was going. Forget it. No, Mom. I shouldn't have asked. "Do you want the daughter answer or the adult answer?" I sat down at the kitchen table. The adult answer. Another pause. "I think Dad loves you." I waited. She continued. "I also think he's gotten really comfortable acting like his life happened because of him." I didn't say anything. Emily said, "Are you okay?" "Yeah, did something happen?" "Nothing I can't handle." That was a mother answer, and we both knew it. Then I asked, "Have you noticed that for a while, Mom?" "What? Everybody notices it." That one stayed with me. Not because Emily was taking my side. She wasn't. She was telling me something worse. What I had been explaining away privately had become visible publicly. The next morning, I called Frank Delaney. Frank had been the company's accountant since Emily still slept in a crib. He was 67, wore the same style of wireframe glasses he'd worn in 2003, and had the emotional delivery of a parking meter. His office was in a brick building off Sawmill Road. I told him I needed copies of some old company records. He didn't ask why. That was another thing I liked about Frank. He found the operating agreement and pushed it across his desk. There it was, my name. Mark's name. 50% each. Nothing's changed, I asked. Frank looked over his glasses. Regarding ownership, yes. No, and I'm still a member? Yes. What about that old line of credit you're still attached to the guarantee? I leaned back. So I'm responsible enough to owe money, but not responsible enough to own anything. Frank considered that. Legally, you own something. You know what I mean. I generally try not to know what people mean. It cuts down on liability. I almost smiled. Then his expression changed, just slightly. Has Mark discussed any restructuring with you? No. Frank took off his glasses. That got my attention. What? A few months ago, he asked me a question. What kind of question? He wanted to know whether there was a clean way to reduce your ownership interest. I stared at him. He asked you that? Yes. Why? Frank hesitated. His position was that the paperwork no longer reflected the practical reality of the business. There it was again. Different words. Same message. I didn't count. I asked, did he say I didn't deserve half? Not in those words. What words did he use? Frank glanced toward his computer like maybe the answer was hiding behind it. He said you hadn't been actively involved in years, and I told him inactivity doesn't automatically cancel ownership. Could he change it without me? Not legally. I let out a breath. Frank added, people do occasionally discover creative ways to make their lives expensive, though. I laughed. I didn't mean to. It just came out. Frank put his glasses back on. I'm assuming Mark doesn't know you're here. No. Then I'm going to give you some unsolicited advice. That doesn't sound like you. It's been a reckless morning. I waited. Get your own lawyer. That Friday I sat across from Rachel Kim in a small conference room downtown. Rachel was 48, direct without being rude, and had the unnerving habit of letting silence sit until you filled it. I explained the dinner, the company, the paperwork, Frank, Mark's question about reducing my ownership. When I finished, Rachel said, first, owning 50% does not mean you can walk into the bank Monday and take 50% of the cash. I wasn't planning to. Good. Saves us both a terrible afternoon. I liked her immediately. She explained that business ownership and marital property were related but not identical questions. There were debts, distributions, guarantees, company obligations, valuation issues. Then she folded her hands. What do you want? I wasn't ready for that question. I want to know what he's doing, beyond being insulting. Yes. Do you want a divorce? I don't know. That answer surprised me with how quickly it came. Rachel nodded. That's allowed. I looked down at my wedding ring. I don't want revenge. Good. I mean, sometimes I do. That made her smile. If revenge is your primary goal, I'm probably going to disappoint you. My primary goal is figuring out whether my husband has already decided I'm disposable. Rachel's smile disappeared. That, she said, is a much better question. I authorized her to review what she could legally obtain and what Frank could provide with the proper permissions. Then I went home. Mark was grilling chicken. He handed me a glass of iced tea and asked why I'd been gone so long. Errands. He nodded. For 3 days, nothing happened. On Monday afternoon, my phone rang. Rachel, I answered from the laundry room. Hi. Laura, there's a warehouse involved. I stopped folding one of Mark's shirts. What, warehouse? The one Bennett Commercial Services owns on Westbelt Drive. I know it. There's a pending sale. I sat down on the edge of the dryer. Mark never told me, I figured. I looked toward the hallway even though I was alone. How far along? Far enough that I think you need to see the documents? Then Rachel paused. There's something else attached to this. What a property near Indian Lake. I frowned. What property, a cottage? I waited for the rest. Rachel said, Laura, have you and Mark been talking about buying a lake house? No, and for the first time since Sunday dinner, I stopped wondering whether this was about my pride. The cottage was on the north side of Indian Lake, about an hour and a half from our house. Rachel turned her laptop toward me when I got to her office the next morning. It wasn't some mansion with a boat dock and 6 bedrooms. It was a modest 2-bedroom place with gray siding, a screened porch, and a patch of grass running down toward the water. The kind of place Mark and I might have looked at together. That was what bothered me. How much I asked. $245,000. And who's buying it? Rachel enlarged the draft purchase agreement. There were 2 names. Mark Bennett, Marilyn Bennett. I read them twice, not me. No. Maybe his mother is paying half? Maybe. Rachel had a way of saying maybe that reminded you it wasn't the same word as yes. She showed me the warehouse documents next. Bennett Commercial Services had bought the building 7 years earlier. We used part of it for equipment storage and leased out the rest. Mark had apparently decided the money tied up in the property would be more useful elsewhere. That wasn't necessarily a bad business decision. After the mortgage balance, fees, and closing costs, the company expected to clear somewhere around $180,000. The problem was what Mark planned to do afterward. Some of the money genuinely needed to stay in the business. 2 floor machines were nearing the end of their lives. Cash reserves weren't great. One of our larger office clients had developed the charming habit of paying 60 days late and calling it 30. But Rachel had found paperwork suggesting part of the transaction was being coordinated around the Indian Lake purchase. Is this illegal? I asked. I'm not calling it that. Is it wrong? Rachel leaned back. As your attorney, I'm going to use less satisfying language. It raises questions. You lawyers really know how to ruin a good sentence. We bill hourly for that. I smiled despite myself. Then I looked at those 2 names again. Mark and Marilyn. Months earlier, Marilyn had been sitting in our backyard drinking lemonade when she'd said, "Wouldn't it be wonderful if the family had a place on the water? Mark had been working the grill." He'd laughed. Maybe someday. I had been sitting 6 feet away. Apparently someday had gotten considerably more organized since then. What happens if I don't agree to the warehouse sale? Rachel pulled up another document. Under the operating agreement, this transaction requires your approval. He knows that he should. No, Mark knew. I remembered his old comment about cleaning up the ownership paperwork. I remembered the refinancing documents 6 months earlier. He absolutely knew. When's closing? Friday. I stared at her. It was Tuesday. I said he hasn't asked me to sign anything. Rachel gave me a look. He will. He did. Wednesday morning. I was standing at the counter buttering toast when Mark walked into the kitchen already dressed for work. He poured coffee and said, "Oh, I need you to sign some boring insurance paperwork Friday. I kept spreading butter. What kind? Corporate stuff. Insurance, property, all the same transaction. 5 minutes. He took his coffee and headed toward the garage. Don't let me forget. I won't. He kissed the side of my head on the way past. The door closed behind him. I stood there holding the butter knife. That kiss bothered me more than the lie. For the next 2 days, I had plenty of opportunities to confront him. Thursday evening, he loaded the dishwasher while I wiped down the counters. "Do you think this refrigerator's getting louder?" he asked. "Probably. We should replace it before Thanksgiving." "Maybe." He opened the freezer and stared inside. "Do we need ice cream?" "We have ice cream. That's vanilla. It still qualifies." He looked offended on behalf of chocolate. I watched him standing there in his socks arguing about ice cream, and for a few seconds I could almost convince myself that Rachel's documents had some innocent explanation. This was the man who'd sold his base boat in 2002 because we were short on payroll. He'd loved that boat. He complained about selling it for approximately the next 11 years. That Mark wouldn't have bought property behind my back. But people don't become different people all at once. Sometimes they just get comfortable doing one small thing after another because nobody stops them. Friday afternoon, Mark came home early. He put a blue folder on the kitchen island. "Here." I was making a grocery list. What is it, the stuff I told you about? He opened the folder and tapped a yellow tab. John Hancock right there. I picked up the first page. Mark grabbed an apple from the fruit bowl. I started reading. After about 3 minutes, he checked his phone. After 5, he said, "Laura, seriously, you said it would take 5 minutes to sign it. I'm reading it. It's standard." I turned another page. "Then it should be easy to understand." He stopped eating the apple. I reached the sale documents. Westbelt Drive, purchase price, closing costs, loan payoff. I read far enough to make sure I had what Rachel and I had discussed. Then I looked up. "What's the warehouse selling for?" Mark didn't even blink before he said, "Who told you there it was?" I put the paper down. "Interesting. What, you didn't ask what warehouse?" He stared at me. "Laura, you didn't ask what I meant. You asked who told me." He tossed the apple core into the trash. "Frank, no." "Then who?" "Who? Why does that matter?" "Because these are company matters." I almost laughed. "Apparently," he rubbed his forehead, "the warehouse is underused. We're selling it. We need liquidity." "Okay?" That seemed to throw him. "Okay, I understand why selling the warehouse might make sense. Then what's the problem? What are you doing with the money, reinvesting it? All of it?" He looked away for maybe half a second. That was enough. I said, "How's Indian Lake this time of year?" His whole body went still. "Excuse me, the cottage." Silence. Then he pulled out a chair. "Okay, before you get worked up, I am remarkably unworked up. My mother and I have been looking at a place. I know. It would be for everybody the family. And my family don't do that. I'm asking because my name isn't on it." He sighed. "My mother was going to contribute. How much we haven't finalized everything, but you've finalized enough to put her name on a purchase agreement. It's a draft, and the money." He started pacing between the island and the breakfast table. "The company needs to sell the warehouse anyway. We free up capital, replace equipment, stabilize cash flow, and then we decide what makes sense." Yes, we. That's funny. I seem to have missed all the deciding." He stopped. "You haven't been involved in the business for years, Laura." There it was. I'm sorry. Not I should have told you. That. I looked down at the documents. "So when the company owes money, my signature matters." "That's not what I'm saying. When you're selling a company asset, suddenly I'm needed. You're twisting this. But when there's money left over, I'm not involved enough to ask where it goes." His jaw tightened. "You haven't touched day-to-day operations in 10 years, and now suddenly you're an owner again." I looked at him. "I never stopped being one." He didn't answer. "You just stopped saying it out loud." I closed the folder. "I'm not signing this today." His chair scraped against the floor. "You cannot be serious." "I am. You could blow up the whole sale. Then I suggest we talk to the buyer." "Laura, this isn't one of your little points about respect. There are employees depending on this company." That hit exactly where he intended it to. He knew I cared about those people. Some of them I'd known longer than we'd owned our house. "I know," I said. "Then sign it." "No." He stared at me. "You're going to cost us a fortune over your pride." I wanted to answer him. I had several answers, none of them useful. Instead, I slid the folder back across the island. Mark grabbed it and walked out. A minute later, I heard his footsteps crossing the living room, then the door to his home office close. I sat there alone, and I kept coming back to the first thing he'd said. Not what warehouse. Not what are you talking about. Not even let me explain. Who told you? For days I'd been asking myself whether I was turning an ugly family joke into something bigger than it was. I wasn't asking that anymore. By Monday morning, the warehouse buyer was threatening to walk. Mark made sure I knew it before I'd finished my first cup of coffee. He came into the kitchen carrying his laptop and set it in front of me. "Read that." I looked at the email. The buyer wanted confirmation by noon that we could meet a revised closing date. Otherwise, he was moving on. I pushed the laptop back. Okay. You keep saying that like it's an unusual word. Laura, if this deal falls apart, we still have the warehouse loan, we still need 2 new floor machines, and we've got receivables sitting out past 60 days. That part was true. I'd spent the weekend going through financial statements with Rachel and Frank. The company wasn't collapsing, but it wasn't sitting on a mountain of cash either. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. "Sign the documents." "No." He threw up his hands. "Then what exactly do you want full disclosure?" "I've told you what the sale is for, after I caught you." He looked away. I continued. "The warehouse sale can go forward. The money stays in the company unless we both approve anything else. The cottage is separate. You don't get to walk back into the business and start making demands." I stared at him. Apparently, I get exactly that many demands. He didn't appreciate the arithmetic. By noon, Rachel had sent proposed conditions through the proper channels. Mark complained about every one of them. Then he agreed. The buyer stayed. The sale was rescheduled. Nobody lost a job. Nobody lost health insurance. And Mark didn't buy a lake cottage with his mother. I should have felt victorious. Mostly I felt tired. Then Marilyn called. I was in the parking lot outside Kroger when her name appeared on my phone. For one brief moment, I considered letting it ring. Curiosity won. "Hello? What are you doing to my son? No hello?" Marilyn had always been efficient. "I just bought chicken breasts. Before that, laundry." "Don't be cute with me." "All right, Mark says you're holding his company hostage." I closed my eyes. "Our company." She laughed. Actually laughed. "Laura, you did paperwork at a dining room table 20 years ago. Closer to 26. That isn't the point. It seems surprisingly relevant. I know who built that company." "Do you?" Her voice sharpened. "My son worked himself sick while you stayed home." I almost reminded her about the payroll, the insurance renewals the client calls Emily, the years when I worked my own job and helped Mark at night. Instead, I asked, "Did Mark tell you how the ownership works? I don't care what some piece of paper says." That sentence explained more than Marilyn realized. She continued, "You always did have a talent for making yourself important." I looked through the windshield at two people arguing over a shopping cart. "Apparently, I learned from your son." She hung up. I sat there for another minute before going inside. And while I was pushing my cart toward produce, I remembered something Marilyn had told me years earlier. Her husband, Ray, had owned a neighborhood hardware store before he died. Marilyn had answered phones there, kept the books, paid bills, covered the register when somebody called in sick. Once at Thanksgiving, Denise had said Mom practically ran that place. Marilyn had waved her off. "Oh, nonsense. Your father ran it. I just helped." I remembered exactly how she'd said it. Not modestly, like what she did genuinely didn't qualify as work. That didn't excuse the way she treated me. But I finally understood part of it. Marilyn had spent her whole adult life using a ruler that made women's work disappear. She'd measured herself with it first. Unfortunately, understanding somebody doesn't make them less exhausting. A week later, I got another education. This one came with spreadsheets. I'd begun privately imagining that my 50% of Bennett Commercial Services would give me a clean financial exit if Mark and I separated. I wasn't planning a divorce yet, but I had started doing that thing people do when they're frightened arithmetic. Half the company, half the house equity. Retirement. Maybe I would be okay. Then Rachel called me into her office with the preliminary valuation information. She had a legal pad in front of her. That was never encouraging. "The company has value," she said. But you're thinking about value the way people think about the number on Zillow. I hate when you know what I'm thinking. "Occupational hazard." She walked me through it. Equipment debt, thin margins, a large customer representing too much of annual revenue, outstanding receivables. And Mark himself. What does Mark have to do with the valuation a lot? Some clients stay because of the company. Some stay because they have Mark's cell number and have been calling him for 15 years. So if Mark disappears tomorrow, some revenue may disappear with him. That's part of the risk. I leaned back. "You're telling me Mark is valuable." Rachel almost smiled. "I realize the timing is unfortunate." I didn't laugh. She continued. "You own 50%. That doesn't mean somebody hands you 50% of whatever number Mark likes to brag about." That was my false little fantasy dying right there in a conference room. Not millions. Not some giant check. Certainly not enough to make starting over painless. Over the next couple of weeks, the reality got less attractive. Legal bills started arriving. Rachel wasn't cheap, neither were valuation professionals. I updated my resume for the first time in years and searched commercial insurance jobs around Columbus. Half the postings mentioned software I'd never used. One asked for advanced CRM workflow proficiency. I actually Googled what they meant. At 52 years old, with 26 years of marriage behind me, I sat at my kitchen table wondering whether I was qualified to do a job I used to be good at. That's when Mark made his offer. He would buy out my interest for a number well below what I'd expected, but he'd make the payment quickly. No prolonged fight, no expensive valuation battle, no uncertainty. "We can fix this," he told me one evening. He'd been sleeping in the guest room by then, but that night we sat together at the kitchen table. For the first time in weeks, he sounded like my husband again. I don't want 26 years to end like this. Neither did I. That was the part nobody tells you about being angry with someone you've loved most of your adult life. You can want to leave at breakfast and miss them by dinner. I looked at his offer. Maybe peace was worth something. Maybe pride was expensive. Maybe I could accept less and move on. Then Mark reached across the table. "We can get back to normal." I looked at his hand. "What does normal look like?" "You stop treating every business decision like I need your permission." I pulled my hand back. "Some of them do need my permission." He sighed. "That's exactly what I'm talking about." Then he said it. "You have to stop treating yourself like my business partner." For a second, I almost admired the consistency. Even his apology required me to disappear. A few days later, Emily called. By then, she'd figured out enough to know we were in serious trouble. "Dad says you're trying to force him out of the company." "I'm not. He says you're using the ownership thing against him." "The ownership thing, Mom, please?" I stopped. She sounded exhausted. "I shouldn't have put you in this," I said. "Neither of you should. You're right. I love you. I love Dad. I'm not going to be the jury." "You won't be. I meant it. Whatever happened between Mark and me, our daughter wasn't going to become Exhibit A." That Thursday afternoon, I was sitting at my computer staring at Mark's buyout proposal again. My cursor was hovering over an email to Rachel. I had almost convinced myself to tell her to negotiate from there. Then my phone buzzed. It was Carlos Ramirez. Carlos had been with Bennett Commercial Services almost from the beginning. "Annual dinner next Thursday. You are coming, right?" I typed. "I don't think Mark wants me there." The reply came almost immediately. "Didn't ask what Mark wants." Then another message. "You signed my first paycheck. Come eat some lasagna." I stared at that one for a while. Then I closed Mark's proposal and typed, "Okay." I almost didn't go. I drove all the way to the restaurant, found a parking spot, turned off the engine, and sat there with both hands on the steering wheel. The annual Bennett Commercial Services dinner was being held at Bellini's, a family-owned Italian place on the northwest side of Columbus. We'd used it for years because they had a private room big enough for employees and spouses without making us commit to some hotel banquet package. Through the front windows, I could see people moving around inside. People I knew, people I hadn't seen in years. For a minute, I felt ridiculous. I was 52 years old sitting in a parking lot because I was afraid to walk into a company dinner for a business I legally owned half of. Then somebody knocked on my window. I jumped. Carlos Ramirez was standing outside grinning. I lowered the window. "You planning to eat out here?" I was considering it. "They charge extra for parking lot lasagna." I laughed. Carlos opened my door. Come on. So much for my graceful escape. I wasn't wearing anything dramatic. Black slacks, low heels, a dark green blouse, the small gold earrings Emily gave me for Christmas. I wasn't there to make an entrance. Unfortunately, I made one anyway. Mark was standing near the bar talking to two supervisors when he saw me. He stopped in the middle of a sentence. Marilyn was sitting with Denise at one of the tables. She saw me next. "Well," she said when I got close enough. "This should be interesting. I was promised lasagna." Carlos, still beside me, said, "I stand by my promises." Even Denise smiled at that. Mark didn't. He came over a few minutes later. "Can I talk to you?" "We're talking. Privately." Carlos took the hint and wandered off. Mark lowered his voice. "Why are you here?" Carlos invited me. "This is an employee dinner. I know. You haven't attended in years. I know that too." He stared at me. "Are you trying to make some kind of point?" No. That was the truth. I didn't have documents in my purse. Rachel didn't know I was there. I hadn't rehearsed anything in the mirror. I wanted dinner. And maybe I wanted to remember whether there was still any part of that company where I existed outside Mark's version of the story. We sat down. Dinner was surprisingly normal at first. I talked to Janice Miller, who'd worked in the office years ago. Carlos introduced me to his wife again because apparently I'd forgotten meeting her twice. A younger supervisor named Tyler called me Mrs. Bennett until I finally told him if he did it one more time, I'd add 10 years to his age out of spite. For 40 minutes I almost enjoyed myself. Then Mark stood to give his speech. He'd always been good at that. He thanked everybody for another successful year. He talked about starting with 1 used van and 2 office cleaning contracts. He mentioned the years when he cleaned buildings himself during the day and wrote bids at night. All true. Then he said, there were a lot of people who thought I was crazy. A few people laughed. My dad thought I should keep a regular paycheck. But Mom always believed I'd make something out of it. Marilyn smiled proudly. Mark raised his glass toward her. To the person who believed in me before anybody else did. People applauded. I didn't. Not because Marilyn didn't deserve his gratitude. Because I remembered sitting at our dining room table entering invoices at 11:30 at night while nursing Emily every 3 hours. Apparently I hadn't believed in him. I'd just been nearby with QuickBooks. Mark thanked several employees. Then he started wrapping up. Carlos called from 2 tables over. "You're forgetting somebody." Mark smiled. "I'm sure I'm forgetting several people." "Laura." The room got quieter. Mark looked at me. Then he gave a small laugh. Of course. Laura supported me at home through all those crazy early years, supported him at home. I looked down at my water glass. Marilyn nodded. That's right. Every successful man needs a supportive wife. I still didn't say anything. Carlos did. She hired me. Mark's smile tightened. Carlos looked around the room. Laura hired me in 2002. Janice lifted her hand. She used to hand me my paycheck every Friday. Someone near the back said, "Didn't she handle the insurance stuff too?" "Yes," Janice said, "for years." Mark put one hand on the back of his chair. "All right, nobody's saying Laura didn't help." Help. Marilyn apparently decided Mark needed rescuing. "Nobody is taking anything away from Laura," she said. "But let's not rewrite history. Mark created what all of you have today." The room went awkwardly still. She looked at me. There's no shame in admitting your husband provided your life. There it was again. Different dinner, same woman, same story. I looked at Mark. Want to tell her? His eyes narrowed. Laura, don't. Marilyn turned toward him. Tell me what nobody moved. I could hear a server collecting plates in the main dining room. I said, tell your mother who owns Bennett Commercial Services. Mark looked around the table. Then at me. Really? Yes. He rubbed his thumb along the edge of his glass. We both do. Marilyn frowned. Both who Frank Delaney was sitting 3 seats down from Carlos. He set his fork on his plate. Mark and Laura, 50-50, since 2000. Marilyn stared at him. That can't be right. Frank took a sip of water. The IRS has been surprisingly relaxed about it for 26 years. A few people laughed. I did too. Marilyn didn't. But Laura hasn't worked there in years. Carlos leaned back in his chair. Neither have you. That ended that. Then Janice spoke, quietly. When Bill had his bypass, Laura called me. I turned toward her. I'd almost forgotten. Janice hadn't. She told me to stay at the hospital with him, said my paycheck would be there Friday and we'd figure everything else out later. She looked at me. It was. That hit me harder than anything else that evening. Not 50%, not the operating agreement. That. Something I'd done 20 years earlier because it needed doing. Somebody remembered. Mark's face had gone red. So this was the plan. I looked at him. What plan? Come here and humiliate me in front of my employees. Your employees invited me. You could have corrected all of this privately. I stared at him. Mark, I've been private for 26 years. He shook his head. This is unbelievable. No, what's unbelievable is that telling the truth feels like humiliation to you. Nobody spoke. I didn't want a trial in a restaurant, so I kept it simple. I didn't take money from this company. I didn't stop the warehouse sale. I didn't threaten anybody's job. I asked to see a major transaction before I signed it. Mark cut in. You held it up for a few days. You've been out of operations for a decade. Yes? Then stop acting like you built everything I built. That was the moment. I could have listed every invoice, every client call every night at that dining room table. I didn't. No, I said. That's the difference between us. He looked at me. I'm not claiming your half. I waited. I'm asking you to stop claiming mine. Nobody laughed. Marilyn looked down at her napkin. I turned toward her. You were right about one thing, Marilyn. Mark worked hard. She looked up. So did I. I picked up my purse. Carlos said you're leaving before dessert. Apparently I've developed standards. That got one small laugh, which was exactly enough. Outside, the air had turned cold. I was halfway to my car when I heard the restaurant door open behind me. Laura. Mark. I stopped. He came toward me, but not with the anger I'd expected. He looked tired, almost frightened. Are you really going to end 26 years over this? For a second, I saw the man I'd married, and that made my answer harder. No, Mark. He waited. I unlocked my car. I'm trying to figure out how many years ago you already did. Then I got in and drove home. The company dinner didn't save my marriage. It didn't end it that night either. Real life is inconvenient that way. You can say the perfect thing in a restaurant parking lot, drive home feeling absolutely certain, and then wake up the next morning wondering who gets the good coffee maker if you separate. Mark came home about an hour after I did. He slept in the guest room. The next morning we passed each other in the kitchen. He opened the cabinet. We're out of filters. I bought them Monday. Where pantry? Second shelf. He found them. Thanks. That was our first conversation after 26 years of marriage had essentially cracked open in front of 30 people. Coffee filters. Again, real life. Within 2 weeks we were talking through attorneys. Not because Mark and I couldn't speak to each other, but because whenever we tried discussing money, we stopped hearing what the other person was actually saying. He thought I wanted to punish him. I thought he wanted to erase me cheaply. Sometimes we were both right. The business valuation became the biggest argument. Mark hated the first number. I hated the second. The appraisers used phrases like normalized earnings and personal goodwill, while I sat there thinking, could somebody please tell me whether I'll be able to afford a house with 2 bedrooms? Rachel kept me grounded. One afternoon, after I'd spent 10 minutes complaining about a valuation adjustment, she put down her pen. Laura, what do you want your life to look like a year from now, preferably without invoices from you? Then stop calling me. I laughed. She didn't. I'm serious, you can fight every number, you may even win some of those fights. But winning costs money, too. That was something I'd had to learn. Being right wasn't free. Neither was leaving. Mark eventually agreed to buy my interest in Bennett Commercial Services through payments spread over several years. It wasn't a giant check. There was no champagne. Nobody handed me a suitcase full of money while Mark stood in the rain regretting his life choices. The number was fair. Not perfect. Fair. Our house in Dublin went on the market. That hurt more than selling my share of the company. We'd lived there 18 years. Emily had learned to drive in that driveway. There were pencil marks inside the laundry room door where we'd measured her height until she was 14, and announced that measuring children was creepy. The young couple who bought the house had 2 little boys. At closing, the wife asked if I wanted the height marks removed before they moved in. No, I said. Paint over them if you want. She didn't. She told me later she planned to put her boys' marks beside Emily's. I liked that. The cottage at Indian Lake never happened. Mark kept the company. I kept my retirement accounts under the settlement terms, received my share of the marital property, and started looking for somewhere smaller. I found a townhouse about 15 minutes away. 2 bedrooms, 1-car garage, tiny patio. The kitchen wasn't nearly as nice as the one I'd left, but every drawer in it was mine. That felt surprisingly good. The harder part was work. I called a woman named Susan Keller who'd worked with me in commercial insurance years earlier. She now ran a small independent agency. I expected a polite lunch. Instead, she said, "Can you start 3 days a week?" I nearly dropped my phone. "You haven't even interviewed me. I worked with you for 7 years. That was a long time ago. So was high school. I still know how to read." The first month humbled me. The insurance business hadn't waited patiently for Laura Bennett to return. The software was different. The portals were different. Half the paperwork wasn't paper anymore. On my 3rd day, I locked myself out of a client management system twice before lunch. A 27-year-old coworker named Josh came over. "Need help?" "No," he waited. "Yes," he fixed it in about 40 seconds. I said I used to run payroll for 28 people. "That's great. I handled workers' comp audits." Impressive. I negotiated commercial renewals. He nodded at my screen. "And today we're mastering passwords." I looked at him. He grinned. I laughed so hard Susan came out of her office to see what was happening. That was when I knew I was going to be okay. Not because I'd suddenly become successful again, because I could be bad at something for a while without feeling ashamed. Mark and I finalized the divorce months later. Emily came home that weekend. The 3 of us had dinner together. That may sound strange, but after everything settled, Mark and I had managed to become civil. Not friends exactly. Parents. 2 people with a long shared history who had finally stopped arguing about whose history it was. Emily raised her glass. "To never making me listen to another conversation about business valuation." Mark said, "I'll drink to that, so will I." She looked at both of us. I mean it. We believed her. A few months later, Mark asked if I'd meet him for coffee. We went to a Panera halfway between his place and mine. He looked older. I probably did too. For a while, we talked about Emily, the company, nothing important. Then he said, "I owe you an apology." I waited. I think I started believing the version of our marriage that made me look best. I stirred my coffee. "You didn't just believe it, Mark." He looked at me. "You needed it." He nodded slowly. I did. Then he said something I hadn't expected. I was wrong. No explanation afterward. No but, just that. I appreciated it. It didn't make me want him back. That's another thing people don't tell you. Sometimes the apology comes after you've stopped needing it. I said, "Your mother didn't ruin our marriage." "I know. She just said out loud what you'd already decided was true." He looked down at his coffee. "I know that, too." That Christmas, Marilyn sent me a card. No phone call, no apology, just a card with a snowy barn on the front. Inside she'd written, "Hope you're doing well." 4 words. After 26 years with Marilyn, that practically qualified as a hostage negotiation. I laughed and put it in the recycling. I didn't hate her. I didn't need a relationship with her either. For a while, I kept thinking about what Mark had said that Sunday. Without me, she'd have nothing. At first, I thought my job was to prove him wrong, make more money, build some spectacular new life, become so successful that everybody who laughed at Marilyn's table would feel stupid. But that would still have meant letting them decide what counted. I had worked. I had raised our daughter. I had helped build a company. I'd supported a man I loved. I'd also made mistakes. One of them was staying quiet so long that eventually silence started looking like agreement. At 52, I finally understood something I wish I'd understood at 32. Keeping the peace isn't always the same as being quiet. Sometimes being quiet just makes somebody else's version of you easier to believe. Mark didn't lose everything. Neither did I. That was never the point. I didn't need his half. I just needed him to stop claiming mine. And more importantly, I needed to stop giving anyone else the authority to decide what I was worth. If you've ever watched somebody take credit for work you quietly carried, you probably know why that dinner stayed with me. And if this story reminded you of someone who's spent years being underestimated, maybe share it with them.